This is episode 5 in a series of 20. A link to the playlist for this series will be added to the description. In the last chapter, we explored how ancient civilizations around the world erected statues and monuments in honor of giants. If the interpretations are accurate, these statues suggest that enormous humans may have once lived on every continent. One place, however, stands out for its enormous collection of such memorials: Easter Island. How ancient people managed to discover this remote island, let alone survive there, is still a huge mystery. Easter Island is a tiny, eerie speck of land in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest continent. It's surrounded by reefs and guarded by two rocky formations, one of which looks like a giant column looming over the landscape. The island itself covers about 64 square miles of mostly barren, unforgiving land. However, despite its harshness, it presents a number of fascinating puzzles for scientists. The strange, isolated terrain of the island, along with its massive stone heads and mysterious underground tunnels, have sparked countless legends. One writer even speculated that the island might be a chunk of some lost world that was destroyed by a cosmic explosion. While that may sound rather speculative, there is definitely something about this creepy, desolate place that makes you wonder if it could be a leftover piece of some other world. Or perhaps even another continent, like Lemuria, for example. Easter Island is such an odd place, some people believed it was placed there by the gods. With how little we actually know about this isolated speck of land, it's not impossible to imagine that higher beings could have once called it home. After all, if anyone was looking for a place to hide from the prying eyes of humans, Easter Island would have been the perfect spot. There are still so many unanswered questions about Easter Island. Who were the people that European explorers encountered when they first arrived? Were they the same as those who originally inhabited the island? Or was there some other civilization before them? And then there's the mystery of the famous stone statues. Who carved these massive figures? How did they do it? And more importantly, why? Could this be yet another example of giant worship? If so, how did this peculiar practice make its way to such a secluded island? Then there are the underground tunnels that stretch out beneath the island and even extend under the sea. What were they for? Did the ancient islanders use some kind of advanced technology to build them, or did they harness nature in ways that we can't even understand today? These are the kinds of questions that have puzzled researchers for decades and continue to do so. But scholars aren't giving up anytime soon. They're still digging, hoping to uncover something extraordinary. An English pirate named Edward Davis supposedly reached Easter Island in 1687. Based on his quick glance, he wasn't impressed. In fact, he described it as a strange, squalid land. Needless to say, he didn't bother setting foot on the island and carried on his voyage. The discovery of Easter Island is generally credited to Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen, who landed there on Easter Day in 1722 and named it accordingly. The Polynesians, however, called it Waihu, meaning land's end, which isn't surprising given its location. Roggeveen and his crew struggled to figure out how people could have built and erected the giant moai statues with no heavy timber or strong ropes. In a bizarre moment, one of the crew members struck a statue with a sword. He claimed that once the outer layer was breached, the inside was just mud. To me, this suggests that by Roggeveen's time, the islanders had lost the knowledge of how to create the original statues and were instead building makeshift replicas out of mud and flint. When Roggeveen arrived, the island had a population of around 5,000 or 6,000 people. Unfortunately, things went south pretty quickly. One of the locals became curious about a sailor's rifle and tried to grab it, hoping to make off with his prize. This sparked a fight, and the Dutch responded by firing on the islanders, killing 12. Not surprisingly, Roggeveen and his crew made a quick exit after that. From then on, the islanders' luck, if they ever had any to begin with, seemed to only go downhill. The first serious studies of Easter Island were done by Captain James Cook and the German naturalist Georg Forster when they landed there in 1774. Forster was immediately struck by how strange the island looked. Huge volcanic rocks littered the ground with barely any vegetation in sight. In fact, Forster mentioned in his report that he saw no trees over 10 feet tall on the island. He painted a pretty grim picture of life there. With just one spring of fresh water, where the islanders had to take turns drinking and washing, the living conditions were indeed rough by our standards. Cook also noted the massive stone statues and was amazed by their construction. He observed that they were built, or rather carved, from huge chunks of volcanic rock with incredible precision, so much so that he couldn't even find any joints between the stones. This is unsurprising, since there are no joins between the stones. These statues were carved from single pieces of volcanic rock. The scale of what the islanders pulled off would have been almost unimaginable to someone like Captain Cook, who, like many early explorers, probably saw the islanders as savages. As for the people Forster met, most were skinny, medium height, with brown skin and curly black hair. But what really caught his attention was that there were also white-skinned men with beards living among them. Beards are uncommon in the Pacific Islands, as is white skin, so it was clear that the population consisted of two distinct racial groups. How these two very different groups ended up on such a remote island remains a mystery. Interestingly, one of Roggeveen's crew had also claimed to have seen giants on the island years before, though Cook didn't spot anything like that. Throughout history, people of all races have been enslaved by others, and even the remote Easter Islanders couldn't escape this horrific fate. Between 1859 and 1862, Easter Island faced a brutal invasion by bands of Peruvian slave traders who captured and deported most of the population, including King Murata. Bishop Jolson of Tahiti protested to Lima, and eventually some of the survivors were allowed to return. Bishop Jolson would later play an important role in the history of the island, but we'll get back to that later. When the islanders did return, it was as if both they and their island were cursed. The few who made it back brought with them deadly diseases, all contracted in the harsh conditions where they had been forced to work. The population of the island rapidly dwindled. One can only imagine how much the remaining islanders must have wished for the days before Europeans set foot on their homeland. Life might not have been easy before, but at least they had their freedom. By the time the Father Iraud arrived in 1864, he found only a few hundred survivors. In fact, the population had declined by 95% since Roggeveen first discovered the island. Yet even then, the exploitation didn't stop. The captain who brought Father Iraud to Easter Island saw the inhabitants as nothing more than labor for the plantations of Tahiti. Another 100 were promptly shipped off into forced labor. What a tragic turn of events for the people of Easter Island. The remaining islanders soon faced a new kind of trouble. A French adventurer named Jean-Baptiste Dutrou-Bornier claimed to have bought Easter Island from the ruler of Tahiti, though it's doubtful the ruler of Tahiti even owned the island, let alone sold it to him. But Dutrou-Bornier was the kind of guy who'd let facts get in the way of his ambitions. Despite the dubious deal, he took control of the island and started a sheep farming business, even going so far as to declare himself the king of Rapa Nui. But his reign didn't last long. His rule was so brutal and tyrannical that even the peaceful islanders had had enough and rose up against him. On August 6, 1876, they killed him, ending his self-proclaimed kingship. By the time of his death, only 111 people were left on the island. After that, Easter Island ended up in the hands of Alexander Salmon, who sold it to the Chilean government on January 2, 1888. It remains a part of Chile to this day. When we think of Easter Island, the first thing that comes to mind is those massive stone heads. They're some of the strangest and most impressive stone monuments on Earth. In fact, their sheer weirdness has sparked all kinds of wild theories. Some believe extraterrestrial visitors placed the statues as communication devices. While there's not much solid evidence to back that claim, it's easy to see why such mysterious creations attract unusual theories. Around 300 of these statues were carved from a single volcanic crater at Rano Raraku, located on the slopes of Teravaka. Since volcanic tuff isn't a very hard material, it wouldn't have been too difficult to quarry. The real mystery is how the statues were moved to their final locations, some of which were up to 10 miles away. The moai weigh as much as 30 tons and stand between 11 to 66 feet tall. But there's one unfinished statue that's a whopping 164 feet tall and estimated to weigh 86 tons. It kind of reminds me of the unfinished obelisk at Aswan in Egypt, another massive project that was abandoned. Maybe in both cases, the builders bit off more than they could chew. Everything has its limits, right? When early explorers asked the islanders about the origins and purpose of the statues, they couldn't provide many answers. This makes sense, considering how much of the population had been lost. Many of those who were enslaved and taken away were probably the keepers of that knowledge passed down through generations. They might have been able to shed light on their mysterious civilization, including who their ancestors were. Some even say they would have known the secret of mana. Mana was supposedly a mysterious force that gave the statues a life of their own. According to some legends, it was this power that allowed the statues to move without human help. Speaking of statues that could supposedly move of their own accord, there is another legend about a man named Tuko Iho. According to the story, he brought the statues to Easter Island and magically made them walk into place. This is mentioned in Island at the End of the World by Stephen Roger Fisher. Thor Heyerdahl, famous for leading the Kon-Tiki expedition, suggested that the moai statues were moved across the island using wooden logs as rollers, with ropes made from plant fibers. Next, they were lifted into place using ramps made of rocks and sand. However, this theory has some serious flaws, as Heyerdahl's own attempt to recreate the process didn't really work out. Furthermore, Easter Island does not have trees large enough to be used as logs. This is due, in part, to the thin layer of soil that covers He Island. Another mystery is that many of the moai statues have been toppled over, while others were left half-finished. Some scholars think the most likely explanation is a religious revolution that banned ancestor worship. But honestly, there's not much solid evidence to back up that theory. There is a local legend that a magical priestess got angry after her children stole her food, so she decided to knock over the statues in revenge. But that's probably just a myth. One of the many associated with the island. Aside from the famous stone statues, Easter Island also has some mysterious inscribed wooden tablets made from a type of wood not native to the island. These tablets have puzzled historians since they were first discovered. What's especially strange about the inscriptions is how eerily similar they are to the hieroglyphics found in pre-Columbian America and the script from the Indus Valley. It's mind-blowing when you think about the distances. Colombia is 7,000 kilometers away from Easter Island, and the Indus Valley is even further away at nearly 20,000 kilometers. In fact, the Indus Valley is just about as far away from Easter Island as you can get. How could such similar writing styles exist in such distant places? For a long time, these inscriptions were thought to be indecipherable, and many still believe that today. But what most people don't know is that a key to the mystery was actually discovered by none other than Bishop Yausen, the same bishop who helped rescue the islanders from Peruvian slavery. I told you he'd show up again. By questioning Easter Islanders who were working in Tahiti, Yausen managed to figure out how to partially decipher the mysterious script, though he didn't make much noise about his findings at the time. In 1953, German anthropologist Thomas Barthel came across photographs of Yausen's notes and realized the bishop had cracked part of the code. It's quite strange that this stayed under the radar for so long, because if anyone could unlock the secrets of Easter Island, it was Bishop Jansen who had the respect and trust of the Rapa Nui people. Barthel soon set out to find the rest of Yausen's notes. Eventually, he was pointed toward the Abbey of Grottaferrata in Italy, where thankfully he uncovered more of these precious documents. One part of the tablet reads, "They came from Rangitia. They disembarked here and addressed prayers to the god of Rangitia." To many, this suggests that the Easter Islanders are of Polynesian origin, arriving around AD 1300 from a place called Rangitia. If they built the moai statues, they may not be as ancient as previously thought, with the earliest likely dating back to around 1350. But here's where it gets interesting. Rangitia is also thought to be a metaphysical place where divine knowledge was handed down by the gods. In Polynesian mythology, the god ancestor Tain is said to have received the baskets of knowledge that were stored in a building called Rangiatea. What's interesting is that these baskets bear a striking resemblance to the mysterious handbag symbol found in ancient art all over the world, but most notably in Mesopotamia. The oldest example so far was discovered at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which dates back around 12,000 years. Interestingly, in Mesopotamian art, birdman-like creatures are often depicted holding bag. These creatures are known as winged genii. There's a Birdman connection on Easter Island too, which we'll get into shortly. One can't help but feel, after learning all these facts, that there's a huge forgotten chapter of history buried here somewhere. But trying to piece it all together is a formidable challenge. But if the Rangitea did indeed build the moai, wouldn't they have shared this practice with at least one other group of islanders? Rangitea is close to Norfolk Island, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, and the Cook Islands. Yet we see nothing resembling the Maui on these islands. What's even more puzzling is that there's nothing like the moai statues on their own island of Rangitea. Polynesians shared most of their traditions across their islands, but this one seems unique to Easter Island. So can we really say for certain that the supposed Rangitea migrants were the ones who built the moai? Honestly, we can't. The origins of these statues are still very much up in the air. Some of Easter Island's mysteries may never be fully explained. Take the birdmen of Easter Island, for example. They seem strangely similar to the firebird found in myths from India, Mesopotamia, the Americas, and the Mediterranean. This bird is often seen as a symbol of one of the supposed mother civilizations of Earth, the legendary Atlantis. Atlantis, of course, is the continent that was said to have sunk into the sea thousands of years ago. Many scholars argue that the story was made up by the Greek philosopher Plato, but symbols, artifacts, and architecture with striking similarities have been found all over the world. This has led some to believe that there really was an advanced civilization that shared its knowledge across the globe, either at its peak or through the descendants of those who survived the catastrophic event that supposedly sank Atlantis. Could the Atlanteans have actually made their way to Easter Island? It might seem that way if you consider the legend that says, many long years ago, a king named Hotu Mata arrived by sea in 2 ships. They came from 2 islands in the region of the sunrise, and after they left, their islands sank into the sea. It certainly sounds like something you could connect to the Atlantis story, but we'd need a lot more evidence to back up that claim. Some people argue that King Hotu Mata probably came from somewhere much closer to South America, possibly from an island that has since been submerged due to rising sea levels. Since the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the sea level has risen by over 350 feet. Centuries ago, the population of Easter Island was estimated to be between 2,000 and 5,000 people. They were split into 2 classes: the common folk, or short ears, and the nobles, known as the long ears, who had their earlobes down to their shoulders, something we also see in the statues. It's pretty wild that even on an island in the middle of nowhere, people were still divided by class. And, as always, when you have a society split between the haves and the have-nots, it eventually leads to conflict. In this case, the long ears saw themselves as superior, which led to a civil war that eventually caused the population of the island to shrink dramatically. The practice of ear stretching has been around for many thousands of years. A 5,300-year-old mummified body was discovered frozen in the Italian Alps in 1991. Believe it or not, he's thought to be one of the earliest known ear stretchers with an 8mm gauge. Quite why Ötzi, as he became known, decided to stretch his ears that long ago is yet another mystery for the ages. Ear stretching is also common among African tribes, and even King Tutankhamun had slightly stretched earlobes. Among the Incas, long earlobes were seen as a sign of aristocracy, which is precisely what the long-eared people of Island claimed to be. It's possible that ear stretching developed independently on Easter Island and in Peru, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting these 2 cultures might have been connected in some way. Many artifacts found on Easter Island bear a striking resemblance to those discovered in Peru. In fact, the similarities are so strong that it's possible the Incas reached Easter Island even before the Polynesians did. Take Vinapu, for example, a partially destroyed wall on Easter Island that features megalithic construction. The wall is nearly identical to those found in Peru, most notably at places like Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman. It's got all the unmistakable hallmarks of being ancient Peruvian construction. For example, the stones are smooth, glazed, and so perfectly fitted together that you couldn't even slide a blade between the joints. There's also an uncanny resemblance between the pedestals of the Easter Island statues and those of the Olmecs, as well as the people of Pachacamac and Tiahuanaco. To add to the mystery, some of the unknown animals found carved at Nazca in Peru also appear on Easter Island on a smaller scale. That can't just be a coincidence. Plus, we see the spiral motif on Easter Island, used by the Incas, Egyptians, and others to represent the number 100, which suggests yet another possible connection. There are also petroglyphs on Easter Island that feature motifs strikingly similar to those of ancient Central and South American civilizations, with elements that even remind us of India, China, and Egypt. If the island was originally inhabited by one group and later settled by Polynesians, it could help explain the conflict between the long-eared and short-eared people. It seems likely that those with Incan heritage, the long-eared people, were either driven out or wiped out by the Polynesian newcomers. The Polynesians may have adopted the ancestor worship practices from the Incan-like people they replaced, which could explain the creation of the moai statues. The idea of giant ancestor worship could have been passed down from the earlier inhabitants, possibly carried into later Polynesian culture. Thor Heyerdahl famously showed that a journey from South America to Easter Island could be done on a simple raft, but it would still be pretty crazy to cross the ocean and stumble upon an island thousands of miles away. In 2019, researcher George Plusos discovered an island chain that stretches from Peru to Easter Island. He suggests that ancient Peruvians might have followed this chain, and by the time they reached Easter Island, many of the islands they followed had sunk beneath the waves, leaving them stranded. This certainly lines up with the legend of Hotu-Mata. But the real question is, did the ancient Peruvians just stumble upon Easter Island by chance? Or were they deliberately looking for it? And if so, why? We explored who might have lived on Easter Island in the distant past, and there definitely seemed to be some Incan influence at some point. However, the island holds relics that are even older than the Inca civilization, like the ossuaries and the Cyclopean tunnels that run under the sea. Throughout history, tunnels have been built for all kinds of reasons: shelter, transporting goods, or even as escape routes. But the tunnels on Easter Island are particularly baffling. What's even stranger is that the tunnels on Easter Island are incredibly well crafted. Whoever built them clearly knew what they were doing. But here's the thing, this is a tiny island, so you have to ask, tunnels to where? Most geologists believe the island has never been much larger than it is now, but it's hard to imagine the islanders spent all that effort digging massive tunnels just for the fun of it. There has to be more to the story. Others have suggested that these tunnels might have been part of a communication network connecting the islands of an archipelago that has since disappeared. A similar system was set up in Hawaii thousands of years ago, so it's possible the same was true for Easter Island. Stay tuned for Episode 6, Lost Libraries and Lost Continents.